Hey, so a while back I did a Will's Top 10 Books ASMR video, but I'm not sure how I felt about that, and so I'm going to replace it with one that's a little shorter and a little easier to hear. And apologies for the audio, my mic is only coming through one speaker and I don't know how to fix that, but I read a lot, like, not joking, hundreds of books in the last 6 or 7 years, so I feel like I'm at least a little bit qualified to be like, hey guys, these are the ones that really stood out for me. So we'll do top 10, and then I'll briefly mention my runner-ups and try to keep this video pretty short. So number 10 is Richard Dawkins and Dave McKean's Magic of Reality. And I'm sorry that's backwards. I don't know how to fix that. This is like an adult children's book of random science facts. I blazed through it in like a day and a half. And if you get this book, I would definitely recommend getting the illustrated version, because Dawkins' writing itself is beautiful, but to add Dave McKean's artwork just really solidified this book's place on my top 10. Number 9, and reserve your judgment until after I've explained myself, please, is Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. Now, if you've read Ayn Rand, most people either fall into the Fountainhead camp or the Atlas Shrugged camp, and there's a lot to be said for the ending of We the Living, which I think is one of the perfect endings in a book ever. But if you read Fountainhead, then don't read it for the philosophy of objectivism or the economic philosophy. I feel like both are pretty flawed, but as a philosophy on art, because as a musician, a shameless plug here, if you're interested in that, definitely check out my channel and let me know what you think. My music is weird, but I think entertaining. But anyway, that aside, I think when you create something, you are trying to experience something that you can't find in the world, and that's the reason why you create it. And so by nature, creating has to be a selfish act, and of course what you do with it after that doesn't have to be selfish. But anyway, this book, though probably the weakest of the 10 on my list in terms of staying power, has influenced me in I think a pretty major way. Number 8 is Andy Weir's The Martian. I'm trying to not get the glare on that. The movie did actually a pretty good job with this book, and Weir's writing is just a breath of fresh air for me, because it's hard science fiction, so fictional scenario, fictional characters, but stays true for the most part to the laws of physics and finding real solutions to that. And it's awesome, it's hilarious, it's a little bit crass, so if the F-bomb bothers you, then maybe avoid this one, but it doesn't bother me. So definitely awesome science fiction. Staying with science fiction is Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. And I'm not cheating, because this is in one book. But the first time that I read Foundation trilogy, I was kind of like, it's alright. But it wasn't until a couple years later, and me reading a lot more history, psychology, science, mostly the history part of that, that I returned to this book and went, wow. like this is very unique. There's not one single protagonist, there's not even one single antagonist until about 2/3 of the way through the book, because it deals with generations of people, and it's just unique, and you can't go wrong with Asimov anyway because his writing's great. But Foundation Trilogy is epic science fiction. Number 6, and continuing with fiction, is The Shadow War Chronicles. And as you can see, I'm definitely cheating because it's 3 books, or in my case, 1 book and 2 audiobooks, and it goes Shadow Moon, and then Shadow Dawn, and then Shadow Star, and so far as I could tell, and I have scoured the audio archives for this, they only made the first 2 into audiobooks, which is kind of a bummer because they're really well done, even though I'm pretty sure that this one leaves out a scene that I really liked. But if you're familiar with the movie Willow, this is the trilogy that follows that up, and almost no one I talked to has heard of it, let alone read it. But if I had to choose between reading Shadow War by George Lucas and Chris Claremont, or Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, I think I'd take Shadow War just because of Allura. The story is a little bit rough. It doesn't do like a lot of stories do with the soap opera thing, where you have storylines that branch out and then kind of come together in the end. This kind of just stays with Allura, and sometimes the action can be difficult to follow, but I don't think you can read this and not fall in love with Allura. It's great. It's one of my treasures. And it's fantasy, right? So, the good guys are gonna win, but it's the way Allura wins that is absolutely perfect. Moving into the top half of my list, we get to the more academic books. Number 5 is Benson Bobrick's Angel in the Whirlwind. For whatever reason, and I usually try to trace these patterns in my personality back to something, and I don't know what this traces back to. I'm fascinated by the American War for Independence, and Angel in the Whirlwind, though I've read a lot of books on it, and there are a lot of great books. This one is probably my favorite. And it seems like a lot of American Revolution books do, like Lexington and Concord, then the retreat across the Delaware from New York, and then Trenton, Princeton, Yorktown, with a little aside about Valley Forge in the middle, and you end up wondering, okay, but what happened in the years between there? And that book goes into it, and it also goes into what happens to Nathaniel Greene, which in most history books that I've read, he just sort of disappears. But yeah, great. Number 4, still in history, is James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom. It's one of the Oxford History of the United States, so it's really long and really well researched, but this book is hailed, I believe, as the best single volume treatment of the Civil War, and for good reason. It's awesome. I think everybody should read the Oxford History of the United States. I think if more people understood more about American history, we wouldn't get so many people latching on to meaningless phrases like "Make America Great Again." History teaches you perspective, science teaches you critical thinking, psychology teaches you how people tick and how other people manipulate people, and I think that knowledge is invaluable. So, moving on to my number 3 book, and I read a lot of history, but if I hone in on anything, it's like the great leaders in history. That's what really draws me, and so that leads me to the 3rd book on my list, which is Larry Tye's Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon. Now, really quick, I'm progressive, but that subtitle almost turned me off of the book. Because when I read anything, history, science, what have you, I want as objective a portrayal as possible. I want to take the facts and make up my mind based on that. I don't want bias, any more bias than I absolutely have to deal with. And so I almost didn't get this book, but I'm so glad that I did, because this is probably the most objective biography I've ever read. It's truly phenomenal. And Bobby Kennedy's fascinating. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, Bobby was Jack Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, and he was also assassinated. Excuse me. But yeah, just watching his learning curve to go from younger Bobby to more mature Bobby, the capacity for empathy just makes him a phenomenal study, and someone I relate to, at least on some small scale. Okay, my number 2 book, and I couldn't do a top 10 list without including something from Carl Sagan, but you know what, because everything he writes is awesome. Everything with him and Androy and his co-authors is awesome. The great thing about Sagan, even though his work is dated at this point, is his enthusiasm for the subject is infectious. It's like if you have somebody at a game night or a party who is just super excited and laughing the whole time, and maybe you don't think what they're laughing about is funny, but their laugh is funny, so you're on board anyway. That's what Sagan does for science, and I went with Cosmos. Even though there's an awesome TV series, even though there might actually be better books by him, this is the one that really kicked off science for me. I read this and like, I'm in. I want to know more about the universe. And, you know, as far as human beings go, Sagan is another one that is just a genuinely good person. Number 1 book of all time. Harkening back to Shadow War trilogy. George Lucas and Chris Claremont, or at least George Lucas, was influenced by this writer. And that's Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is mythology, but it's beautiful. Poetry prose, right? To the point where the first time I would read a chapter, I would read it quietly to myself. Then I'd go back and read it again out loud just because I wanted to hear how the words sounded together. And it's an invaluable study for anybody who is writing or who wants to understand what makes for lasting stories. You can't read this and not come away with a changed outlook on, like, Star Wars or the Shadow War Chronicles. Really, truly awesome book. That's gonna fall. Anyway, to my runner-ups, and I'll try to mention them quickly. Ron Chernow's biography of Washington. If you're studying leaders, I feel like Washington and Lincoln are absolute musts. Gandhi or MLK Jr. as well. Hugh Thomas' book Conquest on the Mexicans (Aztecs) and the Conquistadors is vivid. It's like being there. How to Teach Physics to Your Dog by Chad Orzel is the best book on quantum mechanics I've read, hands down. And I don't have the math to understand it all the way, but maybe someday. Artemis by Andy Weir. It's Andy Weir's second book. It's not quite as good as The Martian, but it's still his style, so it's still hilarious and still has a grounding in actual science. Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which is the book that Matt Damon recommends in Good Will Hunting will, in fact, knock you on your ass. I mean, of my favorite movies, 3 of them are Matt Damon movies. The Martian, Contagion, and Good Will Hunting. So, and Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals is another one that is a fascinating biography of a fascinating man. And lastly, any of the Brian Cox, Andrew Cohen, BBC accompanying books, which are like Human Universe and Forces of Nature and stuff like that, are great science books, and more valuable, I think, than the TV series, even though the series do a pretty good job. So anyway, that's my top 10 books. And sometime I'll probably do like a top 10 favorite board games too, because I'm kind of a nerd, but I'm a sexy nerd who can compose music and sing and play guitar. So until next time, guys, read more books.